All right. Looks like people are still filtering in. We'll get started in just 1 second.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first random review of this new season. My name is Mike Hansen, and I'm co-coordinator of Random Review with my fellow librarian, Bonnie Brzezowski. Today, we're very lucky to have with us Professor Duane Plaza from OSU's School of Public Policy, who will be reviewing the book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McKee. Before we jump into the review, I'd like to take a minute to recognize our co-sponsors for the Random Review program, the Friends of the Library, who provide vital support for this and many other programs that happen at the library. I'd especially like to recognize Connie Georgiou and Deborah Goldenberg. Random Review is in its 32nd season, and Connie and Deborah oversaw the program for nearly half of that span. Thank you for all of your years of hard work. I'd also like to recognize the Random Review Committee for putting together another fantastic lineup of reviews for the coming season. You can find the schedule for this season, as well as more information about Random Review and recordings of the previous reviews on the Random Review webpage on the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library's website. Starting with the next review, Random Review will be back in person in the main meeting room. That next review will be on October 11th with Library Director Ashley Chavez, whose review will cover the most banned books of 2022. So put that on your calendar. It should be an interesting one. There will also, for today's review, there will be a short Q&A period at the end of the review. So please feel free to submit questions throughout the review, and we will answer as many as time permits at the end. And now I would like to introduce today's reviewer, Dr. Duane Plaza. Dr. Plaza is a professor of sociology in the School of Public Policy at Oregon State University. He has been at OSU since 1997. His teaching includes race and ethnic relations, globalization, immigration issues, social justice, and applied research methods. He's written extensively on the topic of Caribbean migration within the international diaspora, and his publications have focused on such topics as return migration, migration and settlement practices of Caribbeans, second-generation acculturation, cultural celebrations and immigration policy in Canada, where he grew up. In 2019, he co-edited the book entitled Carnival is Woman, Feminism and Performance in the Caribbean Mas. Dr. Plaza served as Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts from 2016 to 2018, where he worked to advance student and faculty success. He's also served as Senior Research Personnel of the Oregon State Advanced Research Team. Dr. Plaza was President-elect of the Oregon State University Faculty Senate from 2020 to 2021. And in 2022, Dr. Plaza won the prestigious Richard Bressler Senior Faculty Teaching Award at Oregon State University. And Dr. Plaza is today graciously joining us from Aruba, where he is teaching for a couple of weeks before the start of OSU's fall term. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Plaza.
Thank you very much, Mike, and appreciate the audience that has decided to, 65 people are here to listen in on this review of the book. Folks, I'd like you to actually join me by being part of this presentation if you read the title of this presentation, it's American Public Policy, Naturalizing White Supremacy in Everyday Life. And I'd like you to go to a website called menti.com. If you look right at that screen right there, if you open up a new browser window, it's www.menti.com. And the code that you need to type in when you are there is 13641934. So I'll repeat that again. Please go to the website in a different browser window, www.menti.com, code 13641934. I'll now go over to that place because I have a bunch of questions I want to ask you before we even begin this review to help me understand better who you are and what we all have done thus far in terms of this book. So, great. I see somebody already here. In general today, I am feeling great. So please continue to submit your answers. You should be able to see the menti.com logo at the very top. Use the code 13641934. to participate in this part of the presentation. So in general today, I am feeling, how are you feeling, folks? There's 65 of you. So hopefully we get some more answers. And this will become a very interactive way for us to move forward. Great, I see there's 7 of us now. So again, I want to repeat, if you want to join the folks who are voting right now, you just need to open up a new browser window and type in the word menti, MENTI.com. Once you get there at the website, just type in the code 13641934. Okay, so I've got 12. Okay, it's rising. Okay, we have one unhappy person. Someone is somewhat happy, but looks like the vast majority of you are happy and glad to be here, which is a good sign for me as a presenter, because that gives me a lot of energy as I move forward. So I'll give you another 20 seconds with this exercise, and we're going to go on to the next question. Okay, I see more of you answering. So again, www.menti.com, user code 13641934. Okay, so I'm seeing the vast majority are happy. So let's go on to the next question then, folks. So here's the next question. Next slide. This presentation will contain images, ideas, and concepts that may be new to you. Tell me how you feel about that. Okay, this presentation will contain images, ideas, and concepts that may be new to you. Tell me how you feel about that. Okay, this is a good sign that I'm seeing lots of people who are participating in this telling me this is something that they are okay with. Excellent, excellent. Okay, another 20 seconds on this one. Okay, all right. Now here comes the question I asked most of my students. I'm going to move on from here because it's clearly a good audience that wants to hear new ideas. So let's go on to the next one. Okay, growing up, how far away was the nearest African-American family to where your house was located? So growing up, how far away was the nearest African-American family to where you grew up? Okay, so we're starting to see answers come in. Okay, so we're starting to see a distribution here of participants. So if you're just joining us now, I want to repeat, if you want to participate in this part of the presentation, open up a new browser window, type in menti, MENTI.com. And once you get there, you'll be able to use a user code, and the user code is right at the top of the screen there. It says 13641934. Okay, great. So I can see a lot of folks grew up in neighborhoods where they didn't know where African-American families lived, and or at least a mile away. Okay, so this is kind of very typical of American social apartheid, I'm going to call it, that has existed in the American experience. So let's now go on to the next question so we can see the responses to that. All right, I want you now to think about examples of stereotypes, tropes you have learned growing up about African Americans. Okay, so these could be one word, it could be 2 words, it could be a sentence. So share with us now. These are anonymous. I don't know who's putting them in, but tell me, what are some examples of tropes, stereotypes that you learned about African American people while growing up? Great, I see some answers coming in. Okay, I see us rising here. We got some responses, great. So these are tropes and stereotypes. Tropes and stereotypes are interchangeable words. It just means, what did you know about African Americans or became part of your narrative about what these people were like. So I'm going to start reading down here. Some of these: athletic comes across a couple of times. They were poor, lived in housing projects, they were lazy, black men were dangerous, good with music, again, dangerous, watch your purse, patient, not bright, high crime rate, lazy, disadvantaged. Okay, I see very similar things. Welfare moms, Jackie Robinson, criminals, etc. So again, I want to just comment and say these are typically the tropes and stereotypes that one would expect to see and hear in the United States about African Americans, particularly for people who had very little interaction with them. Many of you indicated that you lived either a mile or you weren't even sure where the nearest African-American family was. Great, let's go on to the next one. Growing up, K through 12, how many teachers did you have who were African-American? So growing up, K through 12, how many teachers can you count that were African-American who taught you? Okay, who actually were in front of you, who taught you one of your classes, right? So it could be anything, but they were there in your classroom. Okay, so I'm seeing a very typical response here. Let's keep going, folks, real fast. Again, I'm going to give you another 15 seconds or so, 20 seconds, and it's pretty typical, this distribution that I've seen many, many times. And the distribution clearly is showing us that the vast majority of you who are participating in this have never had an African-American teacher stand in front of you in K through 12 instructing you. Okay, so let's go on to the next question, and this will be the last one. At college or university, how many professors did you have who were African-Americans? At college or university, how many professors did you have who were at university who were African-Americans? And there's an option here. If you didn't go to college or university, there's also an option there too. Okay, let's keep going real fast. Now with your distribution. Okay, so we're starting to see the mode here is clearly 0. Some people had 1. Very few had 4 to 5, which is only 1 person. And so we're seeing that's a very typical response that we often get. Okay, so now we're going to stop share that. Now we have a context of who the folks are in the room. And I'm now going to share my presentation with you all about this particular book. So let's get started. And hopefully you can see my screen. Yes, you can. I can tell. And let us begin. There are 72 of you now in the room, which is great. So thank you and welcome all for participating in this presentation. So let me begin by telling you my outline for the presentation today is I'm going to start with the Mentimeter activity, which we already did. I want to discuss the main ideas in Heather McGhee's book. I want to then talk about the historical treatment of race as it is linked to notions of a natural order of a hierarchy. I want to also talk about the origins of white supremacy and anti-Blackness in the United States and globally. And then I want to focus on some of McGhee's ideas around 20th century public policy that further advantaged whites. And then I'll end off by talking about where do we go from here? In other words, McGhee has some ideas about how we can create a better America following some directions. And then finally, I'll have some brief conclusions. All right, so let's begin. So I want to talk about the Americans' attitude towards Black achievement. So white Americans' attitude towards Black achievement. So I want to think about the whole idea of the 1960s. And by the mid-1960s then, if you want to think about the United States, the American dream was really much easier to achieve. There were clearly good union jobs around, there was subsidized housing, there was home ownership, strong financial protections, there was a high minimum wage. And America really funded its research, its infrastructure, and it also subsidized education. That's the mid-1960s. Over the past 5 decades, however, as McGhee certainly points out to us, life is becoming increasingly seen by white folks as what she refers to as zero-sum game. In other words, in order to maintain their privilege of the American dream, white Americans have often seen that if they allow or encourage African Americans to have those same dreams, then it would come at a cost to them. And so McGhee really provides us a book that provides evidence where she shows how white Americans are stuck in this zero-sum game mentality that manifests itself in even to their own detriment. They will deny themselves of access to things like good roads, well-funded schools, affordable health care, decent housing, clean air, good jobs that pay well, in order for them to make sure, in a sense, that African Americans don't get access to those same modicums of economic benefit, because they see that if they did give them access to that, their own circumstance would become worse. What's ironic here is that currently about 31 million Americans have no health care. Home ownership rates are falling dramatically. 40% of Americans can't afford the basic necessities of life. The air quality in the United States gets worse every year. We certainly have global warming. The public schools are becoming less equitable with each passing decade. And the richest, ironically, the richest 1% of Americans own 40% of the wealth. And yet, there's a false consciousness idea that this is all because, again, if we gave Black folks any modicum of economic parity with them, white folks would essentially find even more demise. And because of this racist ideology, then social issues often get projected by white Euro-American folks into being a Black problem, rather than it being as a result of racist, for example, government policies that were put in place decades ago, or that the 1%ers are actually able to benefit in a system that we have today. And so as we think about this, then, I want to just summarize the key ideas that McGee has, and then go on to talk a little bit about the history of the United States and the history of race and racial discourse, to make sense of what her key ideas are. So her key ideas include: white Americans have been fooled into believing in the zero-sum game paradigm. Racism has chronically eroded public services. Racism is destructive to democracy in the United States. Racial resentment undermines unions and pits workers against each other rather than having them united with each other. You can't fight climate change without fighting racism first. Segregation hurts all communities. We need targeted solutions to redress centuries of structural racism, and integration and cross-racial organizing create enormous solidarity dividends. So that's an image or a picture of Heather McGee right there. And let's now go into understanding how some of these zero-sum game ideas emerge. And so we'll first start talking about historical treatment of race itself. Again, race is a social construct, right? It's constructed. It doesn't have very much meaning in real biology. It has lots of meaning in terms of people's tropes and stereotypes they have, because it reinforces them. So race, then, races are oftentimes distinguished by skin color, facial type, cranial size, shape of eyes, color of hair, texture of hair, and we oftentimes then connect with that certain characteristics about people. That could be characteristics that include intelligence, how intelligent a person is or not intelligent, their moral character, their intellect, et cetera, et cetera. So race becomes a social construct well before all of us were ever born. It becomes a social construct way into the late 18th century, when people like Charles Darwin are doing his research. People take his research and make lots of conclusions about it, about this whole idea of natural selection and hierarchies of people, like they have in hierarchies of animals. So in Europe and America, then, the idea of race became a way of distinguishing a rigid dividing line between groups. And culture, as well as physical appearance, then become the markers under which people then can codify and classify people into different boxes. And ultimately, then, some of this logic of hierarchy then becomes a justification for things like slavery, oppression, genocide, and of course, annihilation in some cases, because of supposed racial inferiorities. I want you to take a look at that image on the right-hand side there. It's a very important and powerful image because it shapes a pyramid. And at the very top and the pinnacle of the pyramid, you'll see Anglo-Saxon male. And I want you to note, for example, there are no women in this diagram. This would have been a typical diagram one would have found in a geography textbook, a history textbook, an anthropology textbook, a social science textbook of the time. And again, the circa turn of the century, you would have found this in encyclopedias. But again, I want you to think about what the effect of seeing these images over and over in your various textbooks, and teachers talking about this in ways that it sounded like science. Therefore, people then accepted these ideas of hierarchies of groups. If you look at the very bottom of this pyramid, you will see clearly African people. Above them are Native American people, and you've got Asian people coming up the side, but all reaching a pinnacle of a white Euro Anglo-Saxon male. So differences. Differences became synonymous with ability. Differences also became synonymous with, as I said before, intellect and success. And so people's shape of their nose, their eye color, their height, their phenotype, hair texture, all became the external codes that put people into particular boxes and essentially attached tropes to them, stereotypes. And those stereotypes became ones that were oftentimes endearing and lasted a long time. And so this also made sense to people in the time because they were very much into coding and classifying different plants, different animals, different human beings, and that all made sense to people if you could put people on a sort of hierarchy. So I want us to then suggest to you that white supremacy then becomes part of an ideology that also gets circulated globally and is perpetuated by science, religion, and the popular culture. All those working simultaneously to perpetuate this idea in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries that white culture contributes, white culture invents, white culture is successful and creates a better world for us without much question. And so again, I want to point out to you that history lessons, geography lessons that young people are growing up with in their high school and primary school really was perpetuating these ideas that white folks over the centuries were discovering. They were doing great things, that they were colonizing the world, but not necessarily using colonization in a negative way. And ultimately describing the conquest of Europe over the rest of the world as being something that's a naturally ordained by God. In other words, that group was supposed to be at the top of the hierarchy. God ordained it that way. Therefore, they are more successful and they should be more successful according to the sort of nature's ordination. And so I want you to think about this lens that is also taught to people of color. So I want you to imagine then that people of color are also immersed in these worlds of white supremacy, and they also start to internalize this notion of a people of color being inferior and white folks being ones who are accomplished, the ones who do all the hard work, the ones who are courageous, the ones who are heroic, et cetera, et cetera. And again, they're the ones who are natural leaders, intelligent, they're the scientific ones, they're the industrious ones, they're ordained so by God. You know, all this becomes part of a thinking process that gets deeply ingrained and becomes part of a notion of anti-Blackness and white supremacy at the same time. So anti-Blackness then, as McGee actually talks about, becomes ingrained into our cultural DNA of America. And in the United States today, anti-Blackness shows up in our various institutions and our policies and laws that have either already been enacted or are being enacted as we go along. These anti-Blackness policies are also infected the minds of Asian people, Latino people, African-American people. It's invisible. It manifests itself in terms of our own cognitive biases, our own actions and inactions, our negative attitudes towards humanity and Black folks in general. And we often easily fall back into these stereotypes, despite us doing really good work. And I want to acknowledge that I'm sure of the 76 people on this call, many of you do really good work, but I also want you to realize too that you're fighting oftentimes, and so am I, I'm fighting anti-Blackness myself all the time, that this stuff doesn't infect your consciousness and your unconscious actions and behaviors as you go along everyday life. So anti-Blackness became part of an ideology, both in the United States and globally. Again, I mentioned to you it's perpetuated by science, religion, popular culture in the 20th century, such that when I asked you to make a list of the stereotypes and tropes of African Americans, some of these didn't occur in your list, but I'm sure if I gave you enough time, some of these would also have occurred. They're animal-like, they're lazy, they're ignorant, they're childlike, they're inferior intellectually, they're savages, they're lustful, they're sexual, they're untrustworthy, they're musical, they're natural servants, they're ugly, they're swarthy, devilish, villainous, sinful, monstrous. They have powerful bodies. They don't feel pain like everyone else. So all these become hidden within our unconsciousness about how we treat Black folks. And so today then, the meaning of race in the United States really has an effect. It has an effect on people's life chances. It affects where people live. Race also affects how people are treated by different authority figures, by immigration officers, by the police, by government officials. Race also affects how much wealth, power, and prestige one will actually have in American society. It also affects people's individual access to education, housing, and other valued resources in American society today. And also equally important, race has dramatic influences on individual groups' life expectancy in terms of how long people will live. And you can certainly look those numbers up on your own. And that brings me then to talk about something McGee spends a while talking about, which is white privilege. And white privilege really are those unearned assets, advantages, entitlements, benefits bestowed upon a group of people, primarily because they are phenotypically white. And generally, many white folks experience these privileges and do experience them without ever being conscious of it. So, for example, when my wife and I travel through immigration and customs, we oftentimes know that we don't have white privilege. And we know that there are going to be a series of questions asked of us, even though we both carry American passports, about probing about where we've been, how long we've been away, what we're carrying, and so forth. Whereas we can watch people ahead of us in the same lines, not be asked anything, but get the word "welcome home." We don't necessarily get that term "welcome home" very often. We do get it sometimes, but not as often as other folks who are ahead of us in the same immigration lines. Similarly, interactions with police is often a very tense thing for people of color because we don't necessarily get the salutations that are very positive on the first encounter with a police officer, referring to us in a very respectful way. Oftentimes it's very belligerent, and it starts the conversation tone at a very different level. So white privilege then is also very historically based. It's also institutionally perpetuated. And that's what I'm going to talk about next, how institutions in the United States have perpetuated
white privilege. And white privilege oftentimes gets the benefit of the doubt for people who are white in terms of different institutions they come in front of. The benefit of the doubt oftentimes comes in places like the judicial system, where white folks will often get the benefit of the doubt whether they're going to be a menace to society or not. If they're found carrying illicit drugs, or if they're found breaking the law in some kind of way, it's often
seen as a youthful indiscretion rather than a life-term sentence for someone who is a person of color, or more specifically, an African-American person. And so white folks oftentimes are also exempt from racial oppression. So we don't really have a racial oppression of white folks in virtually anywhere they can go. So a white person traveling to Aruba, or where I am now, or a white person traveling to any of the 54 countries in Africa will oftentimes carry their white privilege with them in their suitcase. So I used the images there at the bottom of January 6, 2021 as a great example of how white privilege actually operated in terms of how those individuals were regarded in terms of their insurrection and assault and siege on the Capitol. That whole insurrection was turned around by certain news services and turned into, oh, it was just a day at the Capitol, white men having a good time, those sort of things. Imagine that same scenario if it was a group of brown or black folks coming into that same Capitol that same day, and imagine what would have happened in terms of gunfire and other sorts of weapons that would have been used by the police had those not been a vast majority of white men. Okay, so let's go back in time now. Let's go back and let's talk a little bit about different government policies which started the process of furthering white supremacy. And Heather McGee talks about these in her book in terms of transfers of wealth to white American families. And oftentimes we refer to these as a form of white supremacy, but also white affirmative action that often is never recognized that way. So one of those government policies which emerged in the 1860s was something called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act allowed for white American folks who were coming from Europe to travel west and go to places like Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, Oregon, Oklahoma, etc., arrive in those places and go to the government land tenure office and apply for a homestead plot somewhere out in on a map of that particular state. Now, the requirement was that the family had to essentially clear the land, and they were often given about 160 acres of land. They had to clear the land, and then within 5 years, someone would come by and inspect the land, and if it was under production, then they would be given title to that land. So hence begins the very first example of the wealth gap between white families and families of color. In that whole time this was going on, only about 6,000 of the total more than 1 million so 1.5 million white families got this opportunity. Only about 6,000 black families ever got it. And again, where was this land coming from? Of course, it was being taken from the native population. In the 20th century, there were certainly other policies that were put in play for and benefited white families more than it did any other families. And I'm going to refer now to the Social Security Act.
Under Roosevelt, coming in and essentially creating the Social Security Act of 1935 during the Great Depression. And during that
period of time, of course, everyone was suffering in many different ways. But in order for Roosevelt to actually sign this particular bill, he had to negotiate with the southern states who were against it, because it meant that everybody would get Social Security at the age of 65. They wanted to take out certain occupations to make sure they didn't get Social Security, because they wanted those people to continue working till death came to them. And two occupations that were essentially taken out of the Social Security Act back then were domestic workers and farm workers. So you can sort of figure out who the vast majority of domestic workers were in the United States in the 1930s, and who were the vast amount of farm workers back then tended to be African-American peasant farmers, didn't qualify. Other public policies occurred after the Second World War that essentially led to, again, another division of white opportunities versus no opportunities for black folks. Was the situation around veterans coming back from the war were then granted underwritten loans for buying homes in various places. And so these veteran loans were guaranteed by the government, which meant that you could show up in a housing scheme like Levittowns, which were going up all on the East Coast, and essentially apply to have the government underwrite your mortgage. So they would guarantee your mortgage. So that clearly got you into the housing market. Now, the unfortunate part, of course, of the American history was that in the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s, many of these neighborhoods were segregated. So when black folks showed up in Levittowns or other housing development places, they were essentially told by the neighborhood they shouldn't live there, neighbors. And also, you also had situations where the loan company would not even underwrite the loan that the government was guaranteeing for those people to be in those neighborhoods. Another policy that came after the Second World War was the GI Bill of Rights. The GI Bill of Rights guaranteed all serving veterans coming back from the Second World War an opportunity to get a university education or a college education. They could take their GI Bill to a university and say, hey, I should be able to get in here. The only problem with that for African Americans, of course, is that many universities were segregated in the 1940s and 50s, and so they could only use theirs in historically black colleges and universities, and there was very few HBCUs back in that time period, so couldn't use it. One example that McGee really highlights in her work is the issue of the swimming pools that were once public in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in the United States. One of the things that was very popular in many large cities and even small towns was to have a sort of resort-like huge pool put into those places. And they would accommodate hundreds, sometimes even thousands of swimmers enjoying the hot summer days. Now, with the 1950s and 60s, of course, black communities were saying, hey, we're paying for these pools too. Why shouldn't we be allowed to also use these public pools? Because up to that point, they were segregated pools. And so this one that's being shown here in this image in Montgomery, Alabama, was one that actually the people of Montgomery, Alabama decided, we're not going to integrate this pool no matter what. We'd rather fill it in and nobody gets to use it. And so that's kind of the segue into thinking a lot about McGee's work, and that she's talking about white folks, rather than share the swimming pool, would rather drain it and actually not let black folks swim next to them and enjoy that kind of comfort. Bringing this a little closer to home here in Oregon, we also had many housing covenants that were built into the deeds for houses that are being sold in Oregon and in Washington State and California and across the United States, where the provision at the very bottom that basically says this house can only ever be sold to a person of Aryan or white person. It can never be sold to a person of color. So when you think about a place in Oregon like Lake Oswego, it's no surprise that it wasn't until the early 1970s that any Black people ever got a chance to go and live in that area. Up to that point, it was completely segregated. Oregon also has its share of exclusionary laws and practices that took place. And again, the Oregon Constitution, which granted statehood in 1859, certainly had a provision that's forbid Black people from living, working, or owning property in Oregon. And it was illegal for Black people to even move into the state. So the small numbers of Black folks that did come, that came, and we're not going to go into those small numbers, but ultimately they can experience segregation, terrorism, and all sorts of things that were going on in terms of their lives as they tried to eke out an existence here in the state of Oregon. And it wasn't until 2002 that provision of the Oregon Exclusion Act was actually taken out of the Constitution of the state. Oregon, we also had many things like sundown towns, and again, you'll see a list of the sundown towns to your right. That included from Ashland all the way down to Tillamook and Toledo and Dallas and the Dalles. These were all towns where they had essentially laws that said, if you were a Black person, do not find yourself in this town, whatever, after sunset, because you could be subject to arrest by the local police and thrown in jail. So again, this was a threat, oftentimes to African-American families and African-Americans traveling through or near these Oregon towns, and it was a way of keeping them out of those towns and to settle in Oregon. As I said before, Oregon also had some segregation
too, which also included practices of redlining, and redlining essentially means that agents who make loans to people who want to buy houses will draw certain lines in a big city, and you can see that this is an actual map of Portland, Oregon's redlined areas. And so the eastern part of eastern part of Portland became a segregated part of the city, where that would be the only place that was actually allowed for African Americans to live in. So again, Oregon has a long history of those sorts of policies, government policies, official policies that were designed to essentially separate
Black and white folks into two separate groups. And so it's no surprise that we look at some statistics here really quickly, that you see that white family wealth in 2011 is dramatically higher than Black families or Latino families of any race. So
those numbers are surprising. Those numbers are certainly predictable based on the policies that were in play. And so when we want to think about the United States in general, we certainly have neighborhoods. And again, it comes back to that question I asked you on the Mentimeter: how many people live within a block or two or had Black neighbors? If you were a white person responding to that particular poll that I just gave, you probably had this kind of situation. So you can see a typical neighborhood in the 1980s was 88.7% white. By the time you get to the year 2009, it's still about 75.1% white. So no dramatic changes. What changed in a lot of neighborhoods is the number of Latinos increased, but the number of Black folks in neighborhoods didn't really increase by more than 2% overall in the last 30 years. So what are we dealing with today? And again, I'm going to summarize this very quickly. We're dealing with a situation of white fragility. White fragility is now part of what McGee's arguing about, where white folks are really worried about their circumstance. And it caused the passing of discomfort bills in states like Florida and in other southern states,
where parents got together, went down to the local school board and agitated for the passing of rules that basically would take out certain books, which you're going to have another presentation on that in the next next session of this book reviews. But the idea here is when you start feeling uncomfortable and fragile, that's when you start passing these kinds of legislation that removes.
And folks, brings us back to a time in the world when McCarthyism was around, when the Germans certainly burned and banned books because they thought that those books would cause people to have certain ideas and therefore make people feel uncomfortable. So these are some of the books that have been banned in 2022, and we'll talk more about these likely in the next presentation. But these are books that many of us in this room may have read ourselves and probably start thinking to ourselves, why the heck are you banning these books? Because these books clearly allow people to just experience the world that they may not have experienced in literature. And reading one book is not going to cause you to become part of the LGBTQ community, or it's not going to cause you to become a trans person, et cetera, et cetera. This is the kind of fears that these people who are banning books actually think. And so looking at Florida, then they have anti-critical race theory legislation that's going on under their governor DeSantis. He's got Stop the Woke Act that's been put in play. And so I really want you to think about how these particular pieces of legislation would mean that someone like me couldn't sit here on a Zoom call and actually talk about these things, because that's part of the control of academia also, where the core ideas of the construct of race, or the ideas of bias, the ideas of racism, illegal systems, and so forth, should never be talked about in the context of an education system. And so when we look at a map of the United States, you can see where now you've got signed into law these woke bills, and you can see in the blue, that's where they are. And in the red is where they failed to pass. And in the purple, these are bills still pending in a sense, right? So we're in dangerous times. And so most recently, the governor of Florida, and again, I want to use him as an example because he may be leading a group of people and a group of states in this direction. And they banned a new course in AP history called African American Studies, which is to me very ironic because they banned African American Studies as part of the AP suite of classes, but they didn't ban European history classes as part of the same bans. And so when we think about these very conservative ideas, they really lead us down the road to really living in a society that perpetuates white supremacy and white supremacy cultural ideologies, like I told you about earlier in the presentation. But we sort of end up in a situation now where the possibilities of us having critical conversations about history, geography, science, etc., also becomes on the chopping block. So I want to come up with now, ending off this review, to give some time to have some conversation, with just some key concluding remarks from McGee. And so I want to say that the book for some of us is predicated on the idea that little will change until white people realize what racism has cost them too. And zero-sum thinking has always optimally benefited only the few while limiting the potential of the rest of us, and therefore the whole. Those are some quotes from McGee, and I think those are sort of hit the nail right on the head. And for her, the solutions to the immediate racism that is deeply embedded in systems of American society might include, we need communities where we can reconnect and see in ourselves the wounds that we have, but also the wounds that we inflicted on others. We need to dismantle the corporate structures of oppression. We need to develop a new ethic that values empathy and self-sacrifice. We must reject the cynicism, indifference, and the cult of the self. We must reach out to our neighbors, especially those in distress and those who are demonized. And we must uncouple from our consumer society and turn away from the allure of our cultural narcissism. So it's on that note, I want to say thank you all very much for sticking around with me for this presentation. We have about 15 minutes or so, so I'm going to now do stop share, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mike to help me lead this next part of the presentation, which would be a Q&A conversation that's happening. So I could not see any of the Q&A stuff that was going on, so over to you, Mike.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation. There is a lot of information there. It's a lot of really interesting stuff to think over. We don't have questions open yet. A lot of times they come in at the end, even though I suggest submitting throughout.
Okay.
So, How so how did you feel about the book overall? I'll just throw that out there to give you
Okay,
a
so
chance.
overall, for me, I really like McGee's book because she does a good historical and contemporary connecting the two together. And again, there's a whole trilogy of books that have come out recently with, with looking at how public policy has had dramatic effects on opportunity structures for the United States, and how those opportunity structures have been very different, and how they also affect how mobility can happen in a world where, governments are sometimes unintentionally, sometimes intentionally working with policies that actually will benefit certain groups of society and at the cost of other groups in society. And I think McGee really hits on that in her good in-depth research.
And did you, we do have some questions a little coming in, but did you notice any weak spots that stuck out to you, or potential problems or critiques or anything?
It's really hard to critique good, solid research, which she has done, because she's using multiple sources to get at information. She doesn't only use one. She was part of a research hub at one point where she was the leader of it. And over those years, she's just sort of accumulated these facts that have been, there. The facts have all been there. It's just that she pulled it together in a narrative that allows us to sort of see historically a time frame as all this stuff is unfolding. So what we see today, in my opinion, as I think McGee also has, is that things that are happening today cannot be divorced from things that happened in the past. So to understand the past is really to understand the present, because if you don't, if you have policies that are creating disadvantage in the past, you can't expect a group, when you get to, let's say the year, whatever, present day years, you can't expect the light switch to kind of just flip over and all of a sudden, they'll be at a different stage. So I think all that is really powerful as narratives for us to take from and to realize how important they are. Like, for example, the vast majority of people on this call, I'm pretty sure, have had very little interaction with people of color, specifically Black folks, just because they didn't grow up in those kind of circumstances, because of, again, coming back to past policies about where people could live. That is a slim chance of that happening, or even a slimmer chance of them even being exposed to a professor or a teacher or somebody who is actually someone of a different ethnicity or person who is Black. All that then means to me is that the tropes and stereotypes that one has about those particular groups is not potentially ever broken, because you have no other examples to actually base it on but what you see in the popular culture, or what you imagine is out there, what you hear through your pastor or your priest, or what you hear through your scout leader, or whoever is in your circle, your drunk uncle, your parents. All those become influencers of how you see the world. Even though you'd like to say you filter out all those people, they unfortunately are still part of your unconsciousness in terms of your cognitive biases that are building. So again, I think McGee picks up on all that and captures it. So I see some questions. So I'm going to stop at this point. Maybe you can start asking some of those questions.
And there was a comment there also from a Lauren saying happy birthday. Is it your birthday today?
It is. Thank you. That's actually my wife. And
this was my guess.
Yeah, I turned 60 today. So you got me on my birthday.
Well, congratulations, and thank you again so much for sharing part of your birthday with us.
Okay,
much appreciated.
Thanks.
So another question is, dismantling the corporate structure is quite a feat. Mm-hmm. How would we start to tackle that? Seems especially challenging in our polarized society.
Yeah, that's a great comment, because normally we'd rely, let's say, on our media to help us to have more information about how these corporate structures are really controlling some of the ways in which we even think about issues that are going on in our world today. But when we start to unpack who owns the corporate culture of the media, we start to realize there are certain key people and certain key families and certain key ideas that are going to be put forth, because other ideas would be ones that are detrimental to their existence. And so what I think we need to do is we need to, all of us, start reading alternative sources, start doing our own research, and trying to then use the different types of research that's been done, like from people like McGee, and help others start to see that there is actually other realities to the structures that actually keep us, sort of locked into this, I don't want to call this, but false consciousness world, where we think we know what's going on, but actually what we're only being exposed to is the same old wine in new bottles, right? So it's new bottles, but it's the same old wine that we're drinking all the time, and we're just sort of drunk with those ideas, and we don't really get new ideas. So it's also incumbent upon us to, in my opinion, to get out and start meeting and interacting with people who are not like us, putting yourself in uncomfortable spaces. All that becomes, in my opinion, ways of untangling the sort of corporate structure, which really ties us into a certain world perspective, worldview that's very narrow.
Right. Thank you. So there's a question here about if there's any parallels of prejudice in between the US and the UK. I don't think that the author talks about that much from what I can remember, but I don't know if you have any comments on that.
No, not that I recall, but I can certainly tell you, because I have spent time in the UK doing research, and I've also lived in the United States also. So I lived in the UK for 2 years prior to coming to the United States 25 years ago. But there are many parallels in terms of prejudice in the UK, because the UK, if you want to think about it this way, the UK was the colonizer of the colonized, because the UK was one of the original European countries that was very much involved in the colonization of the world. So that many of the reasons why you can colonize the world, quote unquote, is because you buy into that hierarchy notion that white folks are at the top of the hierarchy and everybody else is below. And therefore, you can convince yourself that you are actually doing a good for that country, one of the 54 countries in Africa. You're doing good for one of the many countries in the Caribbean or India or etc. around the world where the UK actually held domain. And if you can come up with that ideology and buy into it, then you can really follow a racist discourse to be able to put yourself in that place for centuries, where it's okay to exploit these people. It's okay to commit a genocide against those native people. It's okay to do atrocities against those other people, like put them in bondage and slavery, because we're only doing better for them. We're actually helping them. We're doing God's work. And again, I want to parallel this with the connections that took place with religion, which took place with governments and the ruling class, all working together to sort of create this narrative or this ideology that this system that they were existing within was actually the best one they could come up with.
Great. Thank you. There's a comment here also about American consumption and climate change.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I guess in connecting that to racial inequality.
Right. Yeah. So there have been a number of studies, and McGee doesn't really go into this part of it, something called environmental racism. And environmental racism essentially defined this way, where you'd likely go to a place like Portland and you realize that if you disaggregate Portland, you start to realize that most of the hazardous areas where there once was waste or hazardous things that were sited there are often very, very close to communities of color. This is going on across the United States. And so the same thing that goes on with climate change, in my opinion, too, where if you want to think about us as America, we rarely think about the idea of conservation. We oftentimes just think about how do we increase supply of oil and gas and all the other products that we could actually have more of a lifestyle which we're accustomed to. But unfortunately, the earth is now telling us you can't live, we, meaning the advantaged group, which is Americans, can't continue to live without having consequences not only to ourselves, but to the rest of the world. And so, again, how do we reduce consumption? I think we have to become much more minimalist as opposed to what we're doing now. I know that I'm guilty of this. I go to Costco and, the world's my oyster, right? I can pick out this, this, and this, and this without thinking about reusing, repurposing, looking for things that are used as opposed to things that are brand new all the time. All of these become lifestyle changes that we still have not put our head around in North America in ways that we need to, because it's our consumption that's actually causing this pressure on the supply chain. The supply chain would slow down if we had less consumption. That's been my experience.
Thank you. And then here's a question here for what suggestions you might have for well-intentioned allies who live in Corvallis, a blue dot that is not representative necessarily of the rest of America.
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I think there's lots that people in Corvallis who are generally good people to get out of their comfort zones and to interact with people who are not like them. That could involve becoming a volunteer somewhere where you clearly could do some good, some benefit. I know usually on these calls, there's a lot of people who are retirees. How can you as a retiree who have all kinds of skills, when I talk about skills, I'm referring now to likely organizational skills, management skills, and so forth, you likely were. How can you bring that to an organization that doesn't have that in a voluntary way? Those to me become ways in which you can help make changes. For example, at my university, we have different affinity groups, the Black Cultural Center, the Asian Cultural Center, the Latino Cultural Center. Imagine if you had some skills and you called up and you volunteered and said, hey, I could come down and help out with a program for your students who might be having trouble in math. Or I may come down and help your students who are in business school. I could do guest lecture. All those sort of things make a difference. So I'm just saying to you that being an ally goes beyond just giving money, right? So in other words, sure, we can pull out our pocketbook and say, oh, I'm going to donate $50 to that. But what's even more important is your time and your passion. Coming to a place where you can give it to somebody who may be looking for a role model, who may be looking to find somebody who they can identify with, who actually cares about them and their success in getting through university, high school, primary school, etc. I think it starts there, and we create pipelines of people who can get through. I know there's a lot of scientists in Corvallis who are retired. When I say scientists, STEM people, boy, we really need you, in my opinion, in our STEM fields on our campus, especially when we've got new students of color, and they are they're kind of over their head thinking this is overwhelming. What they need is people to be mentors and volunteers and people who can help them calm them down a little bit and to say, I got you through this. I can help you with the math or the science issues you're having now, because I had to go through it also.
And who would they connect with for doing that sort of thing?
I would just call up one of the centers, the affinity centers, for instance, and identify yourself and tell them, use my name, tell them that Dwayne Plaza actually recommended that I call and see if I could help out with any students that are having trouble with X, Y, and Z, because that's my expertise. If that doesn't work, we also have the Alumni Center. And there's a person there now named Carla Rockhold. Carla Rockhold is our new person in the foundation, who actually is now going to be trying to figure out how to do just what I'm talking about, how to bring back either alumni. You don't have to be alumni of OSU. I'm just saying that's what her job is going to be, bring back alumni to become part of those people who become a resource for the university, rather than just a donor. Sure, we like our donors too, but boy, so many of you on this call have so many skills that you likely don't even think about you have, to be giving to other younger people.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. I think that's a great note to end it on. Give us some action points to go do and do what we can to make change.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Corvallis Public Library for inviting me. And I really appreciate the people who showed up and the people who are asking great questions. So thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.